Hi, welcome back. So today we're going to look at the next section in the Gordon West Manual, which is called Mind the Rules. Rules? You mean hard, complicated rules that I have to remember? Don't worry, even though the topic of ham radio rules might seem very scary, this section is actually not that bad. So the rules actually aren't that technical. We've actually already touched on some of the rules, so some of this will actually be reviewed for you. So you'll see once we get started. So the first thing we're going to do is look at simple rules, easy rules, then we're going to look at medium rules, then hard rules, and finally we're going to end with weird rules. So the first thing you should know, we're going to start over at easy rules. The first thing you should know is that FCC Part 97 contains all the rules for ham radio. I've already mentioned that multiple times through this course, so you should already know that. Part 97 deals with the ham radio rules. That's not that hard. Now let's get into some of the actual rules. Now some of these rules are pretty obvious, which is why they're under the category of easy rules. So we're going to start looking at easy rules. That didn't work. Never mind. Now, some of these rules are actually pretty obvious. For example, one of the rules you need to know is that there's no obscene or indecent language allowed on ham radio. You cannot swear or curse or anything like that. And that should be pretty obvious, and you probably already guessed that on your own. That's not that hard. Here's another simple rule. Willful interference is never allowed on ham radio. Meaning, you can't willingly interfere with someone else's conversation or their signal or do something interfering-wise on their frequency on ham radio. So that's also pretty simple, and it's just sort of common sense. There are a few other simple rules. A station licensee must allow the FCC to come in and inspect their station and station records at any time when they request it. So if someone from the FCC comes knocking on your door, which probably isn't going to happen, and they demand to come in and look at your station, you have to allow them to come in. Okay, that makes sense. And another rule is that you must make sure your mailing address is correct in the FCC database and on your license, on your ham radio license. And this is very important because if it is incorrect and the FCC tries to mail you a letter and the letter gets sent back to them and rejected because it couldn't reach you, they're not going to be very happy about it. In fact, your license may be suspended and your operating days will be no more. Some rules are not as obvious, but they're still simple, sort of simple. So I'm going to call them medium rules. Let's move into the category of medium rules. For example, you might be wondering, or maybe you're not wondering, but anyway, what are the rules for the amount of power that you can use in your ham radio transmissions? What are the rules for the strength of your ham radio signal on the air? Are there limits for that, or can you make it as strong as you want? Or what's the rule for that? And the rule is actually very simple. You're supposed to use as little power as you need in order to still be able to make the contact with the other ham, the other person, but at the same time, you don't exceed the maximum power level that you're allowed to use, which varies from band to band and on different frequencies. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Just use as much power as you need, but no more than that. And we'll talk more about what the maximum power level is for each band and everything a little later in this course. Another medium rule, now, I've been saying a lot through this course that you can never use ham radio to make money. And most of the time this is true, but there's actually one exception that I didn't tell you about. See, you're actually allowed to sell your ham radio equipment, you're allowed to sell that on ham radio once in a while, but you can't do that on a regular basis. You can't do it for a living. But say you happen to have an old radio lying around that you don't use anymore, and you decide you don't want it anymore because you have a bigger radio, you can go ahead and try to sell that old radio. A better option might be to sell it online though, but you are allowed to sell equipment on ham radio as long as it's not done on a regular basis. So now let's talk about rules for codes and ciphers, or in other words, things that hide the contents of your transmissions. So for example, maybe you're hoping that you could use secret codes on ham radio so that nobody will understand what you and your friend are talking about as you talk on ham radio. Well, I hate to burst your bubble, but codes and ciphers like this are usually not allowed. You can't use as some sort of secret code to hide the content of your message. Everybody needs to be able to hear, everybody needs to be able to hear what you are saying on ham radio. Everything is public. However, there is one exception. Codes and ciphers, they are actually allowed when you are transmitting commands to a space station or a radio-controlled craft. And the reason for this is that they allow you to add codes here to ensure that not just anyone can take control of your craft. You retain control of it. If you didn't use a code or cipher, then someone else could just come over with their transmitter and make your airplane fly away into the ocean or something. So there are easy rules, there are medium rules. We just looked at medium rules. And now we're going to look over at some hard rules. We're going to go back to hard rules. Back to hard rules. So even these can be memorized all right, though. So let's look at one more sort of hard rule. And this rule has to do with broadcasting. And the hard part actually is defining what broadcasting is in terms of ham radio. So you might think broadcasting on ham radio just means the same thing as transmitting. Like when you're transmitting a signal to your buddy on ham radio, you're broadcasting your voice to him, right? But broadcasting in ham radio actually means something a bit different. The term broadcasting in ham radio means you are transmitting to the public. So think of a commercial broadcast station or music broadcast stations or TV stations. They broadcast music or video to the public, to everyone, but they make one-way transmissions. In other words, like the TV station transmits to your television. Your television usually doesn't transmit back to the TV station. It's a one-way transmission and is made to the public. And ham radio is the same. Broadcasts and ham radio are one-way transmissions that are not necessarily aimed at a specific person, but at the general public. Now, the only time that broadcasting is allowed on ham radio is when you are broadcasting certain things publicly to other hams, such as maybe Morse code practice, we'll get to that later, information bulletins, and emergency transmissions. And in those cases, broadcasting is okay. But other than that, hams are allowed to transmit signals related to broadcasting, program production, or news gatherings only when there is no other means of communication available and if the transmissions are for emergency purposes. Emergency purposes meaning they're either related to the safety of life or the protection of property, etc., etc., etc. So in other words, broadcasting to the non-ham radio public is only allowed in emergencies. Okay, so that's enough of the hard rules of ham radio. Now we're going to look at some weird rules. So actually, there's really just one weird rule that I'm going to go over, and that rule is about music. So you've actually already learned most of this rule. I've said multiple times through this course, or at least once, I think, that transmitting music on ham radio is never allowed, even if the music is just playing in the background as you're talking. It's never allowed. But there is one exception I didn't tell you about, and the exception is what is weird. So you are allowed to transmit music if your transmission is related to manned spacecraft, meaning like the International Space Station and someone's on board. Then you're allowed to transmit music if you have something to do with that in your contact. Now, why exactly are you allowed to transmit music with spacecraft, but you're not allowed to transmit music with anything else? Well, it's actually very simple, and let me explain to you. I don't know! It doesn't make sense to me either, actually. So I don't know, maybe the FCC actually has a heart, and because the space station is so amazing and awesome, because it's this nice, it's floating in space, the space station. Maybe they lax the rules for it. I don't know. In any case, that's how it is. It is allowed to transmit music if you have something to do with manned spacecraft. Anyway, that's all for this section. So what I want you to do now is, once again, go to the Gordon West Manual, study the question in this section, and take the quiz. Good luck, and I'll see you in the next video lecture.